The extra panelist I'm going to invite is Professor Antonio Bertoletti, who's a professor in the Emerging Infectious Disease Program at Duke-NUS Medical School, previously the director of the Infection and Immunity Program at the Singapore Institute for Clinical Sciences. Antonio's current research interests focus on understanding how HBV infections evade or trigger host immunity, causing viral control and/or liver inflammation. He's working on the development of new immunological-based therapies for the treatment of HBV and hepatocellular carcinoma and the characterization of human intrasinusoidal hepatic immune system. After the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, his lab has been actively involved in the characterization of the SARS-CoV-2 specific T-cell immune responses, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Antonio to the panel discussion. So if I'd just like to invite the panelists to unmute, that would be fantastic. I have apologies from Katie. Unfortunately, she's been called to an urgent call, so Katie won't be joining us. But I'd like just to start our conversation just to sort of maybe ask the question about variants of concern and sort of booster doses. So what does the panel consider the potential effectiveness or rationale of booster doses, like, for example, third doses, to vulnerable populations might be, particularly in light of these variants of concerns? And furthermore, should these boosters be of a modified vaccine to include sequence changes? What do you also think about combinations of different vaccines? That's kind of the broad question. Kate, as you're on screen, let's stick with you.
Yes, I think, Jeremy, the jury's out really still in regards to how the wave 1 vaccines will protect against the new variants of concern. I think the situation in India is particularly concerning, as was, of course, the situation in Brazil. I think something that is maybe, I don't know if heartening is the right word, but I think back in December there was a lot of concerns about the South African variant being something that was, could potentially cause a huge amount of damage. But it really didn't come to that. The epidemiology seemed to not, the transmissibility, for instance, maybe, or some of the public health regulations that were put in place, it didn't really come to that. But certainly, following the news in the UK, and there's obviously considerable concern in regards to, the impact of B1617 in the UK, and it's certainly here in the States, in 30 of the 50 states. We are definitely looking at a next generation pan-COVID approach. I think, certainly it is sobering, I think, when you look at the differences between the Wuhan strain to the new variants, and certainly some of these that they're calling in the media the double or triple variants, which is a bit of a misnomer, but they're really quite wildly different from the original strain. So my sense will be that as the virus will continue to mutate, we may well need new vaccine designs, and I think that's very clear when you look at all the developers now are looking at a next generation approach. I think booster doses will absolutely be required, and I think that the opportunity to look at heterologous boosting is going to be absolutely key. Purely from a supply manufacturing standpoint, I think we need to be realistic about the limitations there, and so the ability to kind of co-administer different vaccine platforms to meet the needs of the variants is going to be very important.
Thank you. Antonio, what are your thoughts about that?
So, utility of the second dose vaccination. What is my thought? Listen, I'm studying mainly now the immunogenicity of the messenger RNA vaccine that are extremely strong. So it's really giving a very good immune response. But I'm going back a little bit also to the data that Alessandro has shown. I mean, most of the subjects are, let's say, inducing, and they have a very good T-cell response, but there is always this sort of 10% of subjects that have a low level of T-cell response. So in that sense, I do think it's better to have a second dose. Then when to have a second dose, I think now we will start to understand much more. I mean, everything was done in a rush. We choose to do some sort of, let's say, second dose at 21 days, just to get, let's say, the data out as soon as possible. And I do think it was a very good strategy. Probably 21 days is a little bit earlier. And there start to be some data now out that they are showing that not doing the second dose, I mean, enlarging the time between first and second dose, it could be better. And then, of course, I mean, you know, depends a little bit on the situation. I can tell you what is the situation here in Singapore. There are not a large quantity of vaccine, and therefore, at this point, it's probably better to have a single dose and not a second one, but just vaccinate as much as possible the number of people. So again, depends on the situation also on the field.
I think that was something that was very interesting, particularly in the UK at the beginning of the year when the vaccination program started. Clearly, what the government decided to do was to extend the second dose out to 3 months rather than 28 days. And the evidence is showing actually that was probably, fortunately, a pretty good call. But obviously, that's not necessarily how the dosing regimens are in place across other territories as well. So, you know, we're all learning, aren't we, as we go? So exactly. Thank you for the comments. Alex, what do you think?
So I agree with much what has been said already. A couple of things. One is that the back to the mix and match and delay, certainly a delay in the boost is potentially beneficial for both having a higher response and because of the benefit for supply, excuse me, overcoming supply problems. At the same time, there is data that in the interval between the first and the second dose, people are more vulnerable. So unfortunately, it's not like a clear answer. It's like, yes, there are different factors that need to be considered. Another factor to point out, it's now there is a lot of debate over mixing and matching, you know, getting one shot with one vaccine and another vaccine. That again, there is data in animal models and historical data that mix and matching may be a good thing, also because different vaccine maybe stimulate the immune response in a somewhat different way. The counter argument is that you really don't know what you're doing, because the safety and efficacy data is on what has been tested in phase 3 trials. So if people start to improvise, especially I'm somewhat scared with like people starting to be their own internet experts. It's like, oh, I looked it up this morning and I decided that I'm going to take this and that. That's a little scary. So again, not a clear answer necessarily. Just wanted to go back to the issue of boosters. So the most low-tech approach is to just keep boosting with the same thing. That may work simply because it's a numbers game. So say if the variant is 5-fold less neutralizable, but I keep boosting myself and I raise my neutralizing titer 5-fold, well, we're back to the same place. That has the advantage of that you don't need to do anything new. There is a lot of enthusiasm of making a booster with, say, the South African variant or another variant, which is also well supported by some data. For example, is data showing that people that were infected with the 351, their responses back neutralized the other variants quite effectively. So if that is the case, that is to have a booster with a variant might be beneficial, and either so that's the easiest thing. And the other approach that is considered is what I called Spike Plus, in which in the booster you would add potentially some T cell epitopes or antigens to further increase the T cell breadth, because the data seem to indicate that a breadth of T cell responses may be beneficial in the variants, because it's difficult for a virus to escape a broad T cell response. So I'm sorry, I don't have any clear thing. It's the situation is complicated.
No, thank you. I mean, Antonio, you mentioned, actually, sorry, go ahead. You were about to say something.
No, yeah, I want to ask something to Alessandro, because in one way I'm interested in this idea to say, well, let's get a vaccine and then get a second vaccine with a variant including in the antigenic product. But do we really think this is going to change the repertoire, particularly for T cells? I'm very skeptical about this. Whether, you know, making a vaccine with a particular sequence and then a second one with a different sequence will really alter.
No, I don't think that for T cells is going to matter very much. I mean, it could matter a little bit. I think, to me, the potential benefit is that you would potentially continue to have B cell mutations and select B cells that are cross-reactive between variant A and variant B, and maybe more broadly reactive, or also add just a repertoire on top of the repertoire against A and B. But I see potentially more benefit at the antibody level than at the T cell level.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So, I mean, Antonio, one of the things that you sort of mooting was that about different variants and thinking about, you know, antibody responses, T cell responses, and the links between variants of concern and specifically antibody responses, but potentially that some of these variants might be more selected by T cells. Yeah, do you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on that point?
So, you know, looking at all these variants, and again, most of the people, the research is going towards, let's say, this general idea that the variants are escaping antibodies. I am actually, I wouldn't say convinced, but I'm puzzled by the idea that some of the mutation will also be some mutation that can escape T cells and will give even a minimal advantage of the virus just to survive a few days more. Because you know, I mean, we have so many, I would say, examples from other viral infection where actually the mutation are being selected by CD8 T cells. And I don't see why not in SARS-CoV-2. And I'm back a little bit to what we were discussing before. I mean, the T cell response in patients that have been infected with SARS-CoV-2 is extremely multispecific, no question, strong. But there is always this sort of 10% where the response is less strong and even less multispecific. We do have some subject where actually the response is not so multispecific. Now, I'm not saying, you know, and I don't want, I'm not really thinking of viruses that can completely escape the immunity. No, because this one is not going to happen. But I do think that some viral mutation, I mean, some viruses that are carrying mutation, could have been selected by T cells. And again, it could just be a small advantage of survival. Of course, I would like to demonstrate this.
Good thought. I mean, one thing that we haven't discussed, I sort of a slightly separate topic, but it is about the vaccination of children. The data that we've all seen has obviously been very much focused on adults, and obviously that's where the risk is in the elderly population. So what does the panel think about, generally speaking, vaccinating children? Kate, do you want to kick that one off?
Certainly, it's here in the US, I think we're now down to children 12 and over can receive the vaccine. So there's the Pfizer vaccine, I'm sorry. So, so that's been very emboldening, I think, to see, although I think the vaccine hesitancy in the US for the kids is much, much stronger than what was for the adults. We're still running our adult efficacy trials, so pediatrics are a little bit down the road for us. But I think certainly, you know, knowing that kids kind of are harborers of the virus and super spreaders, shall we say, that being able to vaccinate kids, certainly school-age kids, I think would be absolutely crucial.
But what do you think about in the context of thinking about influenza vaccines? You know, we don't routinely vaccinate children for that. And so for me, it's sort of the same sort of principle as ultimately it's important. I mean, the virus will become endemic. There's nothing we can do about that. It's going to spread around, but we need to obviously protect the most vulnerable parts of our society. Yeah, so I just sort of thinking about how that all fits into that thought too. It's more of an, a slightly not just immunology question, is it? But
yeah, no, it's a great point, and there's actually a lot of discussions about whether it's ethically right to be vaccinating children when they're still, certainly here in the US sectors of society of the highest risk who haven't received the vaccine yet. So it certainly is a question that's going to be struggled with, I think, for governments and for developers alike.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, those are all very good points. I think that certainly, first of all, I think everybody agrees that this has to be done supported by trials that establish the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine, at least in inducing an immune response. After that, really playing in the hesitancy on one hand. The other point, though, is clearly the school reopenings and the safe school reopenings is a big subject. And I mean, that is one of the benefits to be pointed out if the vaccines are safe, which needs to be established. But then next step is why do it? Well, because also another thing to point out that we're already seeing that in the United States, and I assume elsewhere in the world, that the fraction of the cases that is accounted for by children is becoming very prevalent. And that's because obviously if everybody else is vaccinated, who's going to get it is the one that are not get vaccinated. And so I think that there is an argument for vaccinating children. And also I point out that maybe influenza, it's a bit a different case, but most of the vaccines are given to children. I mean, that it's classic, all the pertussis, the hepatitis, so it's not like children have, as a population, have never been vaccinated and we are doing something harsh or.
Yeah, I guess Laura has brought up an interesting point in the chat there about, ultimately, going to the heart of the question is it ethical to vaccinate children now? Not as a full stop after that sentence, but when large parts of the world still lack availability of vaccines for the susceptible populations, that's kind of the key. But of course, that's all to do with vaccine equality and being able to actually get the vaccines to where they're needed, and the imbalance, of course, between the rich countries and the poor countries, and ultimately what needs to be done with COVAX is obviously huge. Particularly with the challenges with Serum Institute in India. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that. I mean, these are questions which are huge. They're political questions, really. But from a point of view of working together, the immunology community has obviously really done a great job and being able to kind of move things forward. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on, great ideas to kind of move this forward in a different way.
No, I mean, let's say when I was thinking about this idea of the children, and definitely I was thinking something that was on the line of what Laura Rivino wrote. There is clearly a big difference between, let's say, a very developed countries and a not so developed country. I'm thinking now, for example, let's say in some part here of Southeast Asia, it's clear that, the children cannot be vaccinated. We are at 2, 3, 4% of some of the countries. And probably there we will have to ask whether do we really need to vaccinate the kids. But don't get me wrong, you see, I'm really on the fence. I think everything that has been said before was really something that I also thinking that probably in a Western society, it's good to do that. On the other hand, if you have to think globally, there are issues, and probably globally in some countries, we have to think about, they will get infected and we'll have a sort of natural immunity. I don't know. That's
it's a tough call. Well, in the final few minutes of our discussion, I'm going to ask you a big open question for all of you that actually Kate posed, which is probably one that we're all thinking. What is the future of the pandemic? Alex.
What is the future of a pandemic? Well,
crystal ball.
It's, I think, certainly this virus has been surprising throughout this year and a half. We've been, the world has been dealing with it. So it's hard to make predictions. I think that the fact that the vaccines do clearly work, it's an important comfort. I think that there are issues related to the evolution of a virus and so forth. There are issues that are now even more center stage related to vaccine acceptance and hesitancy, which also seems to be going better. I think over time, at least in the US, the hesitancy seems to be decreasing. But also the items we're discussing last, vaccine equality. I mean, until you have some countries that are vaccinated and some countries that are not, then nobody is safe, because I mean, there's a lot of issues that still need to be worked out.
Yeah, Kate.
I hate to be a negative Nancy here, but certainly I'm not sure what it's like in Europe, but in the media, they're kind of positioning us at the moment as we're at the end of the pandemic, and mask regulations are being relaxed, and we've had such a success with the vaccine, we're getting back to normal. And I have to say that gives me huge anxiety. I don't think we're at the end of this pandemic. And I have huge concerns about us relaxing all the public health measures just when we could be hit with one of these variants, maybe not one that we know about yet, but certainly something around the corner. So I don't want to put a dampener on what the future of the pandemic could be, and I hope I'm wrong, but I have concerns that, in a few months' time, we might be back to where we were 6 months ago.
Thank you. And Antonio, for the final word.
Oh, more optimistic point of view. Let's put it this way. I think first, come on, it's been fantastic to see how the vaccine has been working. And to be honest, yeah, if you see, let's say, the last 1.5 years unfolding, we have a vaccine that has really been successful to at least control the severity of the disease, which I do think is the main point. So at the end of the day, what I think of the future, yeah, probably we will not clearly eliminate the virus, and I don't think actually we won't. At the end of the day, it's going to become endemic. And I do think we can see that most the vaccine are really able to reduce the severity of the disease, which I do think is what is very important. So in a way, yeah, we will have some struggle still, but I do see a sort of bright future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. You've finished us on time. You finished us on a positive note, but I think it's important to also think of the reality of the situation. And I just want to bring everything to a close by really putting a big hand together for all of our speakers in the session, all of our speakers today, and also for the panelists as well for the discussion. It would not be the same without you. It would be a very boring big Zoom meeting otherwise. So thank you very much indeed. Just to let you know that the talks are basically going to hopefully be available, and we'll announce that. We'll kind of let you know about that. And if any of the speakers have any problems, just let me know. But we would be obviously putting this up with your permission, and everybody be able to access it. So thank you again for joining us today. It's been a bit of a tour de force of immunology for SARS-CoV-2. Thank you so much for those who are staying up very, very late, for those who got up very, very early. We have the pleasure of being in the middle of the time zone and getting to decide that. So thank you for bearing with us. And hopefully the technology didn't prove too cumbersome. And thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it. Bye-bye.